Be seated and make sure your devices are on mute, and we'll get underway. Thanks to the valiant efforts of our AV team, we got the bugs worked out, I guess, and we're ready to roll. I'm Buzz States, a member here, and I'll be the moderator for today's program. A warm welcome to everyone who's joined us today, whether in person or on YouTube, and a special welcome to visitors. Here at the Ethical Humanist Society, we welcome people of all backgrounds, cultures, and identities as we come together to celebrate the richness of our shared experience. We are honored and delighted to have each one of you here today. For any who are new to ethical humanism, a few words about who we are and what we believe. Ethical humanism is a philosophy centered on belief in the inherent dignity and worth of every individual, emphasizing reason, compassion, and ethical principles as guiding forces for human behavior in society. It focuses on fostering personal development, social justice, and the betterment of humanity through rational thought, moral responsibility, and a commitment to human rights and social progress. Our programs are selected to enrich and inform our lives and address topics including philosophy, arts, and science. Today's presentation is part of our ongoing programming relating to the humanities. Today's speaker, Cyndee Schaffer, is the co-author of the award-winning Mollie's War, The Letters of a World War II WAC in Europe, on which she collaborated with her 91-year-old mother based on the letters that she sent home to family while serving in the Women's Army Corps as a WAC stationed in Europe. After Cyndee's talk, the audience will be invited to ask questions. Cyndee is a past president of the Midwest Writers Association and a graduate with a BS in math education from Northwestern and an MS in curriculum development from DePaul. Her work experience has taken her down 3 separate career paths: math teacher in the inner city of Chicago, IT consultant, and now author. Since 2015, Cyndee has been a Rhodes Scholar, that's R-O-A-D scholar, taking her program to small towns throughout rural Illinois with the help of Illinois Humanities to defray the cost. So please welcome Cyndee Schaffer.
Thank you, and welcome to Mollie's War. I'm excited to be sharing this first-person accounting of a brave woman who joined the military during World War II. This is my mother's story and the story of women in the military in World War II. These women helped in forming the military policies that understood WACs as female soldiers who can meet the challenges of serving overseas. It is the tale of an ordinary woman in extraordinary times who became part of the greatest generation and part of the extraordinary wartime effort. It shows a woman who answered the call to serve her country and how her generation changed the course of the country and the military for future generations. This was so out of character for my mother before and after her service. For 2 years, she was a very different person. This is the narrative of what happened to her during those 2 years. There is a quote etched into the World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C. from Colonel Oveta Culpobby, the first commanding officer of the WACs, who later became the first secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. Women who stepped up were measured as citizens of the nation, not as women. This was a people's war, and everyone was in it. The role of a woman in the military has changed over the years. Today, when you read and hear about women in the military, it is not uncommon for female soldiers to be assigned alongside male soldiers in the combat areas. But it was not always this way. From the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, when women dressed as men in order to serve, to today, when women are assigned to combat roles and serve in high-ranking positions. In 2000, the Equality Amendment to the Military Service Amendment granted equal opportunity for women to enter combat support and light combat roles. And women continue to expand their roles and positions in the military. Women have graduated from both the Army's Elite Ranger School and the Army's Elite Sniper School. They can enroll in the Navy SEAL program, and they've been appointed to 4-star general positions. At the 2023 Super Bowl, the Navy flyover was performed by all female pilots. And on November 2nd, Navy Admiral Lisa Franchetti was confirmed as the new Chief of Naval Operations. She will be the first woman to sit on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. During the First World War, women other than nurses were not officially part of the military. Any roles that they served were as volunteers, such as communication specialists or dietitians, but because they were volunteers, they had no official status. The concept of a woman in uniform was difficult for the American public of the 1940s to accept. And that's my mother marching. She's in the front row wearing glasses. However, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the United States entrance into World War II, women's roles began to change. Congress passed a bill on May 14, 1942, to form the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, WAAC. Since they were an auxiliary corps, they did not have the same access to legal benefits and protection as the soldiers in the Army. Because so many men were going to war, it became apparent that women's participation in the war effort was essential. Many women learned new skills in industrial jobs. Hence, Rosie the Riveter. Other women joined the military effort because good clerical and secretarial skills were extremely desirable. The Army discovered an added bonus. One WAC typist could replace 2 men while eating half as much food as one man. Once General Eisenhower brought the Auxiliary Corps to North Africa in January 1943, and their efficiency became known, requests for them increased in Europe prior to D-Day. But if these women were being sent overseas, they needed the protection of being part of the Army. So, in July 1943, after much debate, another bill was passed in Congress, giving women in the Army full military benefits, and they became the WACs, WAC, Women's Army Corps. Serving overseas was considered such a privilege that many WACs gave up promotions and more interesting stateside assignments. There were about 150,000 WACs serving in the Army. 20,000 served overseas. And of those, about 8,000 were serving in the European Theater of Operations. And my mother was one of those 8,000. This also included a battalion commanded by Major Charity Adams of 855 African American WACs who were assigned in February 1945 to the Central Postal Battalion in Birmingham, England. There was such a backlog of mail, and the Army decided they had to do something to ease the problem, since mail was a very important part of the soldier's life and lifeline to their family. These WACs were responsible for the redirecting of mail to all of the U.S. personnel in the European Theater of Operations. and this included Army, Navy, Marines, civilians, and Red Cross workers. Over 7 million people. Their motto was, "No mail, low morale." When mail could not be delivered to the address on the envelope, it was sent to the postal directory to be redirected. They processed an average of 65,000 pieces of mail per shift. At one point, there were 7,500 Robert Smiths. They manually updated the information card for each person in this theater. They worked so quickly that they then moved to France to continue sorting the mail. And remember, this was all done without computers. In March 2022, President Biden signed into law a bill awarding the women of the 6th 888 Battalion the Congressional Gold Medal. There's very few of them still alive today. And now, Tyler Perry is in the process of making a movie based on their story. It's going to be on Netflix, and it's supposed to be released sometime this year. All of these groundbreaking women who joined the military paved the way for future generations of women in the military. Imagine you are a young woman in the 1940s. The world's involvement in World War II, as well as America's, had been raging on for several years. The media continued with their campaign to urge women into the workforce. Here is a quote from the women's recruiting movement of the 1940s. "Never in history has there been such an urgent need for American women to serve their country. This is total war, a war in which every woman, as well as every man, must play a part." My mother had several reasons for enlisting in the WAC, in addition to her patriotic duty. A favorite cousin was killed in the South Pacific in a flying accident early in the war. 2 of her girlfriends enlisted, and then she looked around and said, "There won't be any men left my age, I might as well join." And at the time she was 27, so she was a little bit older than a lot of the people enlisting. At first, when she tried to enlist, she was rejected because of low weight. She weighed less than 100 pounds. In order to enlist, you had to be at least 5 feet tall, weigh 100 pounds, and have at least 12 teeth. You have to ask your dentist about that one. She went home and fattened herself up, and then she was accepted into the WAC on September 1943 and on her way to a new adventure in wartime Europe. Our journey to writing and publishing a book began when my mother enlisted in the WAC. WACs were an essential part of the fighting forces in World War II, even though they were not in combat. They handled highly classified material, worked long hours with few days off, and were exposed to a significant amount of danger. They assisted in the planning of D-Day and subsequent operations. To meet the European theater's heavy demands for skilled typists and stenographers, recruiting was stepped up, the All States campaign and the Job Station campaign. In the first, General Marshall asked state governors to assign committees of prominent citizens the task of recruiting statewide companies for the WAC, who would carry their state flags and wear their own state armbands while in training. And my mother was from Detroit, Michigan. This is her armband, and her family didn't throw anything out. And he's pretending to be Vanna White. The Job Station campaign allowed recruiters to promise prospective enlistees their choice of duty and assignment location after they completed basic training. My mother wrote extensively to her sister, although wartime military censorship prevented any detailed discussion. Her sister saved this correspondence. My mother was in the medical intelligence section in the Army, which was established by the Army Surgeon General to provide medical and health-related information about the areas in which the Army was preparing to move into, so that medical services would be prepared for the conditions they would find when the troops arrived. My mother's responsibilities included determining the availability of hospital beds for the next military operation and working as a stenographer for a senior medical officer. She took dictation on medical intelligence activities on belligerent nations, handled all secret and confidential material, maintained all files. There was an article about medical intelligence in Collier's magazine and reprinted in the Reader's Digest in 1943. I was able to locate a copy of that article. In summary, medical intelligence was the difference between an army ready for action and an army ready for the hospital. And this was all accomplished without the use of instant access in the internet. They relied on old information from World War I, maps, and local civilian accounts. Mollie's War recreates a world that existed more than 75 years ago by taking you through the romantic and always frightful journey of an American WAC during the height of World War II. It is not a tale of life on the battlefield, but rather a tale of the battlefield of life and love. This collection of vivid letters recounts my mother's experiences. Mollie's story documents the human side of life during the war, a life that alternates between fear and romance, exhaustion and leisure. She was assigned and completed basic training in Daytona Beach, Florida, which was the second training camp for WACs after the Army discovered the harsh winters in Iowa. In Florida, you usually didn't need winter clothes. My mother found basic training to be very intense, but she learned to follow the orders. She endured the strict regiment entailed in such training, just the same as the male soldiers. Learning military protocol, how to march in step, how to salute, how to fire a gun, how to navigate the obstacle course, how to keep their belongings organized, and how to make all of these new tasks into habits so ingrained that they would require no thought during their service. Then her first assignment was in Wilmington, California, where on the day she arrived, as luck would have it, Warner Brothers Studio was just finishing up a WAC recruiting film, and she became an extra. Here is an excerpt from the letter that she wrote home about the film. 12 February 1944. Dear Beck, all we WACs assembled in the Port Theater for the premiere showing of It's Your War Too. Before the picture was shown, our commanding officer made a little speech and said that many of the scenes were cut out, not because they were bad, but because of the continuity and because it was necessary to make it short. I naturally thought the brief scenes I was in were cut because I had come in on the last day and there were no retakes on my dramatic scenes. I was watching the picture intently as it progressed. It's really just a group of scenes. And my gal friend sitting next to me said, "There you are." It was funny that I had hardly recognized myself. It was the coverall scene. I don't look too hot, but it's not too bad. Then I saw myself in the conference scene. But anyway, it was quite a thrill to see it. When we got through seeing the picture, we came back to the barracks, ate supper, and got our clean linens. Then we all set to work, cleaning and scrubbing for Saturday's inspection. There are no temperamental stars in our barracks. This WAC recruiting film was shown in movie theaters during World War II, prior to the feature film. And now, it's your war too.
There goes one of those petticoat soldiers now.
Yeah. My sister wants to join the WACs. What do you think of that?
She's crazy. What the devil's a woman want to be a soldier for?
Just a waste of time. This is a man's war. What sort of jobs can they do?
What sort of jobs can we do? Take a look, mister. X-ray technicians, inspectors of Army meat, teachers schooling our soldiers. WACs are classification experts, assignment interviewers.
So this is a man's war, is it? WACs are at work on every sort of Army vehicle, doing every sort of motor transport job, testing walkie-talkies, testing radio tubes. Those are just a few of the jobs they do. There are 239 more. Hey, you two armchair generals on the porch, here's something more for you to think about. Listen.
General Eisenhower said, in many jobs, WACs do the work of two men. The Army needs and can use all it can get.
And listen to the women of the United Nations. They, too, have some ideas on the subject. The English with their calm courage, the stalwart women of heroic Russia, the Canadian and Australian women, the women of China with their undying fortitude, and tens of thousands of American WACs. What are their ideas on the subject? Listen.
We shall live up to the legends of our fighting men.
Where did these thousands come from? Where will the United States Army get thousands more? Thousands to back up manpower for battle abroad. Who are the women who will help retain the needed manpower for the production battle at home? Who are the women who will help fight our country's war? It's Mary Jones, Jane Doe. It's the idle housewife and the girl next door. Oh, yes, it's your war, too, Miss and Mrs. America.
Here at Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia, one of the most beautiful Army posts in the world, we, the newly hatched WACs, gather to learn what all the shooting's about. Our kind of shooting. From morning till night, we hustle through a very novel, interesting life. Not just classes and drill and duty, but all kinds of women's sports and recreation. We work hard and play hard. We learn that the Army's privileges as well as its hardships are ours. We get furlough rates on trains, special prices at theaters, special life insurance rates. We know that the rumors about the WACs are so much hot air. Scratch that one out. Off-duty, rayon, or whatever you can get.
You can't use makeup.
No rouge.
No lipstick.
No nail polish. No rouge.
No lipstick. No nail polish.
No rouge.
No lipstick. No nail polish.
No rouge.
Toss that one in the ash can.
Everybody's hair is alike. The same old hairdo. The same old hairdo. The same
Nonsense. Our hairdress is up to us as long as it's neat, smart, and off the collar.
All work and no fun. All work and no fun.
Strictly Axis propaganda.
WAC training centers at Fort Oglethorpe and at Des Moines. WACs go forth to army posts, camps, specialist schools, air bases, to every part of the United States. Savannah, St. Louis, Newport, Baton Rouge, Seattle, Santa Barbara. To Washington, our nation's capital, come hundreds of WACs, many to be stationed in the famous Pentagon building and attached to the combined chiefs of staff. WACs are entrusted with tasks involving the utmost secrecy. Here, the important work of decoding messages whose information must be carefully guarded and transcribed with perfect accuracy. At Aberdeen Proving Grounds, valuable men have been released for combat duty by WACs, inspecting mammoth tanks, computing ordnance firing tables for the light, accurate American carbines, the carbines that have canceled the effectiveness of many a Nazi and many a Jap. Here, they also check the efficiency of remote control units and make secret ballistic measurements. These are just a few of the important and interesting jobs done by WACs. At air bases here and overseas, women soldiers perform over 25 technical jobs. War jobs now, but civilian careers later on.
We are in the machine shop, in the repair shop. We rig the parachute. We guide our flyers home.
Altitude 5,000 feet, 5000. Request landing instructions.
Mitchell Field Tower to Army 3131. Circle field twice at 3,000 feet.
Let me in, will you? I've got a heavy date tonight.
Keep your chute on, Lieutenant. Field won't be clear for 5 minutes.
Potential American pilots are taught blind flying by our WACs. They are taught to handle night raids over Europe and the Black Pacific, taught to navigate safely through black space, loaded with hidden peril. Thousands of WACs volunteer for overseas duty, eager to serve in the actual theater of operations, the goal toward which they've worked and trained. Wherever the American armies will go, WACs may follow. Women have proven their definite value in England, in North Africa, in Algiers, in New Caledonia, India, and Egypt. Every WAC making the war shorter by a month, a week, a day, a minute. Yes, wherever the American armies will go, WACs may follow. To Berlin and Tokyo, too. Ladies and gentlemen, General Marshall.
The Women's Army Corps is an integral part of the Army of the United States, and its members, who are soldiers in every sense of the word, perform a full military part in this war. There are hundreds of important Army jobs which women can perform as effectively as men. In fact, we find that they can do some of these jobs much better than the men. As more and more American soldiers engage the enemy in combat, women must replace them at overseas bases and at posts in this country. In view of the urgency of the situation, enlistment in the military service should take precedence, in my opinion, over any other responsibility except imperative family obligation.
In 1918, we were on the sidelines.
When the war has been won, the women in the Army will march shoulder to shoulder with the men in the great victory parades that will celebrate the return of peace to the world.
After her assignment in Wilmington, California, my mother went back home to Detroit on leave, and this is a picture of my mother with her mother and her older sister, Rebecca, and most of her letters were written to her sister, Rebecca. Then she went to Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, which was a staging area for WACs going overseas. She was stationed in England before the D-Day invasion began, and also while the country was under bombardment by the unmanned German bombs. And my mother is the fourth person marching in this picture. Censorship prevented her from discussing her job, but here is an interesting letter. Yesterday, I went to see Madame Tussauds' famous waxworks. It's amazing how lifelike those figures are. In fact, as I walked in, I started to speak to a girl attendant to ask where we could purchase programs, and was most chagrined when I discovered it was a wax figure. I turned around to see if anyone had noticed my slight error. Then I walked cautiously about and decided not to speak to any of the attendants. You can imagine my further embarrassment when we were about halfway through the exhibition and started to go on to another floor. I edged up pretty close to a figure at the head of the stairs and stared at it quite frankly, and then he spoke to me. It was a male attendant, and I understand he has been fooling the public for about 15 years. Although I can't tell you anything about my job, other than it is medics and is now secretarial, it is most interesting. My mother's work continued in London as the preparations for D-Day, June 6, 1944, completed. D-Day was the largest military operation in history that the Allies launched against occupied France on the beaches of Normandy. It is now after D-Day, and the Allies have made great strides into occupied France. In retaliation, Hitler scientists have developed unmanned fantastic flying machines, V-1 rockets, also called buzz bombs or doodlebugs, that were launched by the Germans from somewhere along the French and Dutch coasts with just enough fuel to reach London and then randomly crash land somewhere in the city. London is constantly under attack. When these attacks first began, WACs were frightened and would seek protection in the air raid shelters. But soon they learned they could wait out the air raids in their apartments. The bombings became a part of their daily routine, and they just went on with their lives. Even as my mother was getting ready for work, she didn't stop her preparations as the doodlebugs went gliding overhead. But my mother said that they were terrified when the bombs were sent at night, and then the next morning they were happy to be alive. They would look around and see all of the bombed out areas surrounding them. Here is the letter that she wrote home after Winston Churchill's speech, telling the world of the German attacks by the buzz bombs. 26 July, 1944. London, England. Dear Beck, by the way, I wasn't going to write to say I was in London because I knew you would all worry. But if you promise not to say anything to Mom and Pop, I will relay a few interesting items. Restrictions on the doodlebug situation, as far as our mail is concerned, have been lifted somewhat since Churchill's speech. In fact, I could have written a few weeks ago about it, but held off. But now I have gotten to a point where I feel a lot of those people back home who sit back complacently ought to know there is a real war going on. And Beck, I see it every day. The air raid sirens are a frequent sound to us during the day as well as the night. And it means the real thing over here. Those darn buzz bombs come a-floatin' round. They have been our unwelcome visitors both day and night since approximately 1 week after D-Day. I am sure that many of the people I write to think, because I only write of pleasant things, that there is nothing else that enters into our little lives. I don't believe that people back home can grasp any part of the situation over here. I, of course, have many incidents to relate. which will have to wait until I see you. However, this one, through the courtesy of the censor, I know you will find interesting. One night, after a particularly busy day at the office, I was sleeping most soundly at our billets. It happened to be in the early days of those confounded things. Well, anyway, their roar was terrific, and yet I slept. I noticed a heavy feeling on my head and awoke drowsily to feel my bunkmate holding onto my hand and sitting on my bed. She had placed my helmet on my head, and we both listened for the darn motor to shut off. And fortunately, it didn't land where we expected it to. You can bet your boots we both felt to see if we were wearing our dog tags. Another sight always gives me a peculiar feeling and really penetrates. When I see the busloads of children being evacuated from London to safer places, having separated from family and friends. Taking it all in all, it really is a great experience and certainly makes one appreciate the good old USA more than you can realize. I know you are anxious about me, but don't be, because for some reason, I am most calm about it. Even if I had the opportunity to go home right now, I don't believe I would take it. No, not until this war is really over. She was among the first WACs to enter Normandy after the D-Day invasion. The WACs followed closely behind the fighting forces, slept in the field in tents, on army cots, ate field rations, and took baths in their helmets with cold water. She used her 4 years of high school French to converse with the civilians and learned about the terrible conditions that they had lived under the German occupation. She actually paid attention in high school, learned and remembered her French. She was transferred to Paris a few weeks after it was liberated by the Allies and frequently served as an informal interpreter in both work and social-related situations. Here is an excerpt from another letter. Paris, France, 16 September 1944. Dear Beck, I know that you wonder how I am getting along with the French language. I'm doing wonderfully well. In fact, yesterday, I acted as an interpreter. Last night, a number of us went to the Arc de Triomphe. We wanted to go up into it and see the view of Paris, but the guard there said we could not at that time as it was closed for the public. Perhaps later, he said. All that in French, and he could not speak a word of English. Then we walked away. We didn't get very far when I heard a shuffling of feet and turned around. There was the guard making a beeline for me with an Air Corps captain in his tow. The captain asked me if I could speak French, and I said a little. He asked me to ask the guard several questions, and I translated the answers. It was great fun, and I understood everything. They were trying to determine whether our pilots had flown any planes under the Arc, which was against regulations. Anyway, the answer was no, at least for this guard. My mother enjoyed experiencing French culture because, unlike many of the Americans stationed in Paris during the war, she was able to understand enough French to go to French films and theater and to follow the dialogue. She was able to travel the city on public transportation and on foot because she could read the street signs and follow the directions. She also read the French newspapers and said that it added to her vocabulary. She was still stationed in Paris on VE Day, May 8th, 1945, and took part in the revelry of the celebration. She commented in a letter written after VE Day that it's so wonderful to feel every plane flying over is friendly. Right after VE Day, my mother wrote home in a letter, "Frankly, I don't know what the Army will do with us, But please don't think just because VE Day has been declared, all I have to do is run out to the docks and grab a boat home. The Army doesn't operate like that. Very soon after VE Day, a new theme appeared in my mother's letters, probably a theme in every soldier's letters, that of the point system. Although there was a point system for discharge, there could be other extenuating factors. Starting in June 1945, my mother wrote that stenos and typists have been declared essential in this theater, whether you have enough points or not. The point system theme continued in her letters home throughout July and August. She was still with medical intelligence, and they were the department who reviewed the extensive records that the Nazis left, claiming that their experiments were done to enhance medical research. They found that this was not true. After living in Paris, she was transferred to Versailles, where she lived a country life for about a month and even worked in a horse stable. The stable had been converted into offices for the US Army. My mother was always sending French perfume home to her family. Because she was working in a horse stable, her mother wrote to her and said, "Keep the perfume, you need it." In August 1945, she was transferred to Germany with the Army of Occupation and witnessed firsthand the devastation of the country. In a letter written from Frankfurt, my mother commented, "Although the European war has been over for some time, there is a great deal of cleaning up yet to be done. They are still digging through the debris in the bombed buildings. Frankfurt is still quite a mess, even though they say it has been all cleaned up. All the bricks have been piled high, so they make a fence around what used to be buildings." In September, my mother writes again about points. So what I want to bring out is this. I don't have one darn thing to say about it, and I am not kidding. I didn't want to go to Germany and just lacked 2 points. I saw colonels and captains galore. As far as being essential, the stenos are no longer in that category. Finally, in early October, my mother gets the word that she will be leaving Frankfurt to go home. After serving with the Army of Occupation, my mother began her trek back to the USA in October 1945. She and other WACs took a train from Germany through France. They crossed the English Channel and arrived in London. Then they boarded the Queen Mary on November 3rd in Southampton. The Queen Mary, a luxury ocean liner built in 1936, but put into service in 1942 as a troop ship, was the fastest ship in the world. She was very useful during World War II because she could outrun the German submarines and torpedoes. My mother and her fellow servicemen and women set sail on the morning of November 4th. After less than 5 days at sea, my mother awoke at 2:30 in the morning on November 9th and went on deck to hear Tommy Dorsey and Martha Ray welcoming them home and to see an illuminated Statue of Liberty in the midst of darkness. She knew she was home. Now, I know it's 11:15. It's okay if I continue. Okay, thank you. I had a suitcase of letters that my mother wrote home. For some reason, her family didn't throw out her letters. Included in that suitcase were lots of memorabilia, about 350 letters, newspaper clippings, and photos, which fortunately my mother had labeled with names, dates, and location. Writing a book based on letters from the 1940s was a formidable task. In order to actually be able to use these letters in a book, I needed to read them and transcribe them, about 1,000 pages typed. I also needed to be familiar with the content of the letters, so I would have a general idea of what I could edit out for a book. Nobody would want to read 1,000 pages of letters. It became a family project as my husband, sister, daughter, and son all helped. My uncle, my mother's younger brother, read the first draft. My mother said she didn't need to read the draft because she was there. Even as I was transcribing the letters, I began going to the Pritzker Military Library in downtown Chicago once or twice a week. Because of censorship, my mother could not write about her work or where she was located. Many letters indicated somewhere in England, somewhere in France. She could only write about pleasant events, sightseeing, and boyfriends. I had to investigate and put historical context around the letters so the book would put proper perspective of the events occurring at that time. Because of the historical nature of the subject matter, the head librarian thought it was important to find a traditional publisher and not to self-publish. A traditional publisher would vet the book and give credence to the accuracy of the information contained in it. In June 2008, she helped me find McFarland Publishers, a leading U.S. publisher of nonfiction books located in North Carolina. They were planning on launching a series of books about women in the military, and they thought my mother's experiences would be excellent to begin their series. But then I didn't hear from them for quite a while. I also tried to contact the people who played a prominent role in my mother's life during the war. It was an amazing journey as I connected with some of the people or their children, and we have become email buddies and even Facebook friends. The close friendships that my mother formed with her fellow WACs were typical of the experiences of many women serving in the Army during World War II who found a special camaraderie there. Over the years, my mother corresponded with her 4 closest WAC buddies. But in October 2007, my mother received a letter from Lodo's daughter, Kathy, saying that Lodo had passed away. Lodo was the last of my mother's close WAC friends. I knew that this was the time to write the book with my mother. She was 91 and really wanted to share her story. When McFarland Publishers finally offered my mother and me a contract in May 2009, I had the book written, 150,000 words. We accepted the contract, and they assigned us an editor from Wales. The publisher wanted at most 110,000 words, so we had some very serious editing to do. We communicated strictly via the internet. Through the miracle of modern technology, I never met my editor nor my publishers, and yet we negotiated a contract, edited, and published an entire book. My mother passed away in April 2012 at the age of 95. But seeing the smile on her face when she held her book in her hand was priceless. Peppered throughout her letters was the fact that she always wanted to write a book, and it happened only 65 years later. Working with my mother on this project was a very strange experience. It is impossible to know what your parents were like before they became parents. But using my mother's actual letters and photos felt like being transported by time machine to another era. Reading my mother's words and seeing photos of my mother as a young carefree woman who made decisions for herself and traveled the world during the most treacherous time of all made me realize the full life that she had before she became a wife and mother. I think so many of us never have the opportunity to see our mothers and fathers as well as people separate from the family. The woman in these letters was not the mother that I knew when I was growing up. She was a very different person when she got married and had a family. Sometimes we forget about the role that women played in the Second World War. Women stepped up and were able to make a significant contribution to the war effort, both at home and in the military. These American women showed courage in helping the fighting men, sharing in the disappointments of the soldiers, celebrating their successes, and finally rejoicing in the complete victory. They responded to the challenge and achieved their mission. They also served. With fewer and fewer of these female veterans still alive, this is a story that has its place in the history of women in the military. Thank you.
Thank you, Cyndee.
You're welcome.
That was fascinating. Thank you. So before Cyndee takes your questions, we're going to take a short musical break. During the break, we invite you to support our programs by donating as baskets are passed around. Are we going to pass baskets today? Sure. Great, great. Let's see. $5 is suggested, but any amount you can contribute is appreciated. You can also donate on our website. Come up to the microphone with your questions. If you're joining us via YouTube, you're invited to type your questions into the comments, and I'll read the questions on your behalf.
Before we start questions, is there anybody here who served in the military? I spoke at the Illinois National Guard last year, and we had about 80 soldiers. And I said to them, I usually ask if anybody has served in the military, but I don't think I will today, because everybody was in uniform. I don't know if anyone has any stories they want to tell about maybe their parents served, or they have children who serve, or husband or wife who served. Questions?
All right, I'll start. I've got
Okay.
a question. During a little reading about the WACs that I did last night, I learned that there was a smear campaign, apparently an orchestrated smear campaign to try to drum the WACs out of the service. Did you learn about that? Do you have anything you can share?
Yeah, there definitely was, because of course the WACs replaced the men. The men had, nice cushy office jobs, and when the WACs came and took those office jobs, a lot of the men were sent to the front line, so they were not real happy with that. So yes, there was a campaign.
Well, just a quickie anecdote about my father. he was already an older father when, not a father, older at that time when World War II came. So he was draftable because he was not married. But he obviously was not going to serve in combat. So he actually served as an Army band director. And he directed either the 65th or 67th Army Band. I can never remember, but I have a picture of him posing with his band there. So he obviously wasn't in danger there, but many years later I happened to be on a business trip myself and ended up in Linz, Austria, a town there, small industrial town, and I had a plaza there, and I think I mentioned that to my father, and he said that he gave a concert with his band in that plaza.
Wow.
Somewhere, obviously, after Austria was okay.
How
So it was
neat.
interesting. I had cousins and an uncle that served also, but yeah.
How did your parents meet?
Oh, well, you got to ask over there so people hear what I'm answering.
How did your parents
No, you got to go to the microphone. But I think there's other questions.
How did your parents meet?
Interesting story. Before the war, my mother was from Detroit, my dad was from Chicago. He had 4 younger sisters. And my mother was on vacation in South Haven, Michigan, and one of my dad's sisters was also on vacation in South Haven, Michigan. And somehow they got to be good friends, and my dad's sister would send my mother salamis to Paris. So if you read the book, you will see my mother had all these different boyfriends and all these different proposals. She couldn't make up her mind. She said, I have to go home to Detroit and think about it. So she was honorably discharged, went home to Detroit November of 45. Well, my dad was still in the Army, but he went to visit one of his sisters who happened to live in Detroit. So the sister from Chicago set my mother and dad up on a blind date, New Year's Eve, 1945. On their second date, my mother said to my dad, for 2 cents, I'd marry you. He gave her 2 pennies, and they got married 3 weeks later. And they were married for 54 years till my dad passed away. And over there are the actual 2 pennies, because they didn't throw anything out. Okay, question?
Okay, well, I'll just comment, because you said stories. And can you hear me? Okay. My father was born in 1909. Now, he was the youngest of many siblings, so there was an age difference. So I have a cousin, and I consider myself young, but cousin who was older, and I really didn't know. But he was the only son of my oldest uncle and his wife. And so he died in France. And I was really young, but I remember this at the cemetery and the soldiers shooting, the rifles up in the air. But the story that I want to relate further down, and I can't remember what year, but not too long ago, 5 years, 7, whatever, in Normandy when they were celebrating in France, people that died, he was in the Air Force, died in the Normandy in France. They invited relatives or people of the deceased. So I had a younger cousin, went there and received a watch. This was 1940, a watch that belonged to him.
Oh, wow.
And that was given, so
Gives you
that was the
goosebumps.
story.
Thank you.
Hi, I have 2 questions. First, did you hear about any of these stories growing up, or did your mother kind of keep that part of herself, a secret from her children? And then the second is, after she was back and got married and had children, did she work outside of the home? Did she use kind of all that experience and keep working?
Okay, first question. The only reason we knew that my mother served in the military is that my sister and I would wear her uniform as a Halloween costume. But I will say, when we discussed World War II in school, and back then you actually did discuss World War II in school. My mother would always have a letter, a newspaper article, a photo, something that was appropriate to whatever we were discussing in school. And I also remember in 1994, which I believe was at the 50th anniversary of D-Day, my mother being so upset the entire year. The whole year she wasn't herself. So, and your second question? Yes. Before my mother joined the military, she worked at the Veterans Administration Hospital in Dearborn, Michigan as a medical secretary. And then during the war, she was in medical intelligence. And as soon as my brother went to school full-time, so he was the youngest, as soon as he was in full days, my mother worked at Garfield Park Hospital. We lived on the west side. She worked at Garfield Park Hospital as a medical secretary. And then from there, she eventually worked at Edgewater Hospital. But my mother would always say that you can't say, I'm a secretary. She said, you have to be very specific. So she was always a medical secretary. And I know if you see the movie and they talk about all these jobs that the women were going to have when they, got out of service and when the war was over, and the majority of them did not get jobs because the men all came back and they needed jobs. So, but my mother did work outside the home.
Hi. Since you said include some comments and things, even though I wasn't in the military, I worked for the Department of Defense in the United States just for like a little over a year, and I don't think I had the personality for that. I worked in library with maps, so what I wanted to know is, how do you think your mother had the kind of resilience before she took this job to work in a position like this? Because I felt like for me, working with a lot of military personnel that could do a lot of mathematical things was, I didn't really, even though I did some of that, I couldn't really understand it, and I feel like I didn't have the personality to work in that kind of a situation for very long. So do you think that going into this, she was already very resilient and adaptable?
Absolutely not. I've talked to my uncle, my mother's younger brother, and he said that when she was growing up, she was a very quiet, meek kind of person. I truly think that she was 27, she was still living at home, and I think she just wanted an adventure. And she was very adaptable because she had an easygoing personality. She wasn't somebody that got upset about things. She was somebody that would say, let's sit down, let's discuss it, let's work it out. But I really think she wanted that adventure. And she was 27, what are her parents going to say to her? But also, my aunt, her older sister, was already 30, and she was still living at home. And my mother's brother, who was 22, was still living at home. So I think my mother just saw, if she didn't join the military, she'd still be living at home. Her mother was from the Ukraine, and she left when she was very young, never saw another member of her family. So I don't think her mother could say anything to her. Her father was also from the Ukraine. He left, but somehow he was able to bring his whole family over. He brought his mother over, he brought his sisters and brothers over, but he was very upset. And according to my uncle, he would cry every night that my mother was in the military. But because there weren't that many women in the military, my mother was always in the newspaper. So he would take the newspaper article with the picture of my mother, and he would walk down the street and he would say, look, this is what my daughter is doing. So he was very proud of her. So, you're welcome.
Since your mom was alive when the book came out and she was able to be there at the book launch, I'm just curious to know what kinds of questions she enjoyed answering the most, or what kinds of stories came out when she was talking with people who had read the book. So what sort of additional, because I'm sure you heard a lot from her during the process of writing it, but I'm wondering what came out during the questions, or what sort of things seemed to spark her interest. What sort of things did she seem to enjoy discussing the most?
I was always very nervous when they would ask my mother, what did you do? You know, when they would ask her questions, because I never knew what kind of answer she was actually going to give. So one of the times when they asked her a question, she said, "I can't believe I took all these pictures with my $5 Brownie camera." So she would talk about her friends and the boyfriends. She talked a lot about the boyfriends. So there were lots of them.
We have a question from one of our online viewers.
Yes.
Did female World War II veterans receive VA benefits comparable to those received by male veterans?
The WACs did, yes. When they were the Women's Auxiliary Corps, they did not. But when they became the WACs, they were full Army, and they received all the benefits. If my mother wanted to go to college, if they wanted to buy a house, she received all those benefits. I know there were some groups that didn't, but the WACs received. And they were paid the same. I think it was it the SPARS? One of the groups, the WASPs that took the planes, that ferried the planes, they didn't get recognition until much later. But the WACs were full Army. And then in 1978, they became part of the full Army, and they were no longer WACs.
Okay, if there aren't any further questions, we'll wrap it up here. Thank you, Sue.
Okay, thank you. And I do have memorabilia, and I have books for sale if anyone's interested. They're $20.
Thank you. Okay, Cyndee and Doug will be available for more questions and conversation during the social hour in the reception hall. I'll now read announcements of upcoming events as they're projected above. So first up, our next community chat will be on Wednesday, February 28 at 7 p.m. We share friendship, issues of the day, and fun in a caring Zoom chat. Join us to connect and appreciate and enjoy each other's company. Next Sunday, February 25th, we'll have another Community Day program on epistemology. What and how do we know? In an era of alternative facts, disinformation, and conspiracy theories, how do we know how do we know what we know, and how do we learn what we don't? Led by EHS member Charlie Sachs, we will explore our approaches to knowledge, learning, and critical thinking, and how they inform our understanding and beliefs. Next, our Humanist Kids are sponsoring a food drive to benefit the clients of the Niles Township Food Pantry. There's a flyer on the table in the reception area with a list of items most needed, along with a box to collect your donations. For more information on upcoming Sunday programs and other activities, see our website at ethicalhumanistsociety.org, connect with us on Facebook and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for videos of past speakers and future streaming programs. If you're a visitor, if you haven't already, you're invited to fill out a card at the welcome desk so we can send our newsletter to you. If you have any questions about the Society, please look for a member with a welcome name tag, or help yourself to literature that's available in the reception hall. Thanks, and please now join us for coffee hour.